All right, welcome everyone to the deep dive. Today we're strapping in, getting ready to explore the world of Azure networking security and DNS.
Yeah, think of it like, we're taking a deep dive, really unpacking those core components that make a secure and well-managed Azure environment possible.
We've really dug through a ton of material on this topic. Our goal today is to make sure that you walk away understanding just how critical network security groups are. We call them NSGs for short,
Right, NSGs.
Azure Firewall and Azure DNS.
Yeah, those are the real MVPs when it comes to securing and controlling your network traffic. Plus, DNS is the magic that makes those user-friendly domain names work, so we got to cover that too.
Absolutely. By the end of our time together, you should not only be able to recognize these components, but truly grasp how they all work together to give you that control and security you need in Azure. So are you ready to get started?
Definitely. Let's jump right in.
Awesome. Yeah. So first things first, we call this slide 1, Azure Networking, Security, and DNS.
Catchy, right?
Yeah, exactly. As we just talked about, we're really honing in on the foundation of Azure networking security and the absolutely essential DNS services that everything kind of relies on.
It's all connected, right?
Absolutely.
And we're going to break down specifically NSGs, those network security groups we were just talking about, the Azure Firewall, and Azure DNS.
This isn't just some checkbox exercise either.
No, not at all. These are vital. We're talking securing your network traffic, making sure everything goes exactly where it's supposed to, and of course the whole system for turning those nice, neat domain names into the IP addresses that computers actually use to communicate.
Yeah, because computers, they don't speak English, do they? They speak numbers.
Ones and zeros, the whole bit.
Exactly. And Azure DNS is that translator. So it's vital to see how these three elements, they all fit together in the big picture.
Totally. Think about it. Whether you've got virtual machines running, web applications hosted, or really, anything going on in Azure NSGs, Azure Firewall, Azure DNS, they're all working tirelessly behind the scenes.
Unsung heroes.
Yeah, you could say that. And they have a huge impact on your security, how well you're protected from all the bad stuff out there, and how easy it is to manage everything, keep your cloud resources organized.
Okay, so let's zoom in on slide 2, network security groups, NSGs. Now, if you're new to this whole Azure world, imagine NSGs as like the bouncers at a club.
Yeah, the gatekeepers.
Exactly. They control who gets in, who gets bounced out.
Right at the entrance of your Azure resources, making those decisions.
And what's really neat is where you can place these bouncers. You can stick them on a network interface, which is basically like the ID card for a virtual machine, or you could apply them to a whole subnet. Think of a subnet as like a designated section of your virtual network.
Right, a whole neighborhood of resources. And here's the thing, it's a one or none kind of deal. You can only have one NSG at a time for each network interface or subnet.
You can't double up on the bouncers.
Nope. But, it's totally fine to have none at all if that's what your security needs dictate. Now, you can put NSGs directly on those individual network interface cards, like if you've got a VM or a specific network appliance that needs its own rules. But generally speaking, we strongly recommend going for the subnet level.
So the whole neighborhood gets the same security. Why is that usually the preferred approach?
Because, let's be real, it just makes everything easier. You're essentially setting up a basic security fence around a whole group of resources.
Like a gated community.
Yeah, exactly. All those resources inside automatically get the same protection.
So if we're using the bouncer analogy, it's like having one set of rules at the entrance to the whole neighborhood, rather than checking IDs at every individual house.
Exactly. Consistent security, less hassle. And it's all thanks to those security rules within the NSGs.
All right, let's break down those rules a bit more. That's what slide 3, NSG rules and configuration, is all about. You mentioned them before. What are they, and how do we actually make them work?
All right, so first off, Azure doesn't leave you hanging. It automatically sets up some default security rules for every NSG you create.
So some basic protection right out of the gate.
Yeah, a good starting point. Now, you can't delete those default rules. Microsoft's got your back there, basic security hygiene, but you can override them.
How do we do that?
Custom rules. It's like adding your own house rules on top of the general neighborhood ones, and you prioritize them.
So like if my custom rule says no loud music after 10 p.m., But the neighborhood rule says quiet hours start at midnight. Which one wins?
The earlier one, right, your custom rule. It's the same with NSGs. Lower numbers mean higher priority.
So a rule with priority 100 gets checked before one with, say, priority 2000.
Exactly. Now, one of the most important default rules is basically saying, hey, no traffic from outside our virtual network allowed in.
Seems reasonable.
Right. It's a default deny stance. But of course, there are exceptions. Things like Azure load balancers have got to be able to communicate, keep everything running smoothly.
Makes sense. So when we're building our own NSG rules, what all do we need to specify?
You got to be specific. You got to tell it the service, which basically means the protocol, is it TCP, UDP, that sort of thing, and the port range.
So like if I only wanted to allow web traffic, I'd specify TCP and port 80, right?
Exactly. Or, you can be a bit more open and use an asterisk, the wildcard, to say any port. Then you got to define where the traffic's coming from and going to.
The source and the destination.
Yep. That could be a specific IP address, a range of IPs, or even a service tag. Those represent groups of Azure services.
Handy. And of course, we got to set the priority.
Right. And finally, the big decision, allow or deny.
Simple as that. Now, what happens if we have energies applied in multiple places, like at the subnet level, and also directly to a network interface within that subnet? Do those rules, do they fight each other?
It's a good question. And the answer is they don't fight, but they both got to agree. They're evaluated independently.
So if the subnet NSG says yes, but the network interface NSG says no, then it's a no overall.
That's exactly it. Think of it like two checkpoints. You got to get a thumbs up at both to get through.
Makes sense. That's why it's so helpful that Azure gives us that effective security rules view.
Oh, absolutely. That shows you all the rules that are actually being applied to a specific resource.
Yeah.
Super helpful for troubleshooting when things aren't working like you expect.
Yeah, you can see exactly who's saying no and why. All right, so we've talked about NSGs for subnets and individual network cards. What about slide 4, application security groups, ASGs? Where do these fit in?
All right, so ASGs, or application security groups, they're a whole different way to think about managing security rules. Instead of focusing on IP addresses, which can change, servers can get new IPs, ASGs let you group your servers based on what they do.
So like if I had a bunch of web servers, I could group them together under an ASG called like web servers.
Yeah. Exactly. Then in your NSG rules, you just refer to that ASG instead of listing out all the individual IP addresses. It's way more scalable, especially when you've got, a lot of servers coming and going.
It's like instead of saying John, Jane, and Mike can come in, you just say the marketing team is allowed.
Perfect analogy. Makes managing those rules way easier, especially when, John leaves the marketing team and Sarah joins. You just update the group. No need to change all the individual rules.
So it simplifies things a lot, especially in dynamic environments. Now, what if I have an NSG on a subnet and one of the rules mentions an ASG, but there's a VM in that subnet that's not part of that ASG? Does that rule apply to that VM?
Nope. ASG rules only apply to members of the ASG. Even if the NSG is on the whole subnet, it's all about membership.
So you got to be in the club to follow the club rules.
Mm-hmm.
All right, that's clear. We've covered how to control traffic with NSGs and ASGs. Let's shift gears now and talk about slide 5, Azure Firewall. What does Azure Firewall bring to the table that's different from what we've talked about so far?
So Azure Firewall is like your all-in-one cloud-based security guard.
So it's not like those individual bouncers we talked about with NSGs. It's more like a whole security team, right?
Yeah, exactly. It's a dedicated service that you deploy. And the best part is it's managed. Microsoft takes care of all the infrastructure stuff.
So less for us to worry about.
Exactly. And it comes with built-in high availability. No need to set up extra stuff for redundancy.
High availability, that's always a good thing. So what else makes Azure Firewall special?
Well, for starters, it's got centralized policy management. You can create rules and policies that apply across multiple subscriptions and virtual networks.
It's like having a security control center for your whole Azure world.
Yeah, exactly. You get a really nice overview and a lot of control. Another cool thing is that it uses static public IP addresses for all your resources that need to talk to the internet.
Why is that so important?
Well, it makes things easier to manage, for one thing. You don't have to worry about IP addresses changing all the time. And it makes it simpler to integrate with other security systems, like if you have firewalls on premises or you're using third-party services.
So it's like having a consistent, reliable address that everyone recognizes.
Exactly. On top of that, Azure Firewall plays nicely with Azure Monitor.
Oh, that's great for getting insights into what's happening, right?
Absolutely. You get all sorts of logs and analytics about your traffic and the firewall's activity.
So we can spot any suspicious activity, and we've already touched on this, but that built-in high availability means you don't need to mess around with load balancers or anything like that.
It just works. And you can even configure it to span multiple availability zones when you deploy it. So even if one zone goes down, your firewall's still up and running.
That's some serious resilience. And it scales automatically too, right?
Yep. As your traffic grows, Azure Firewall can handle it. It's a really powerful and flexible solution for protecting your whole network.
So it's like having a security blanket for your Azure environment.
Exactly. All right, so let's talk about how to actually set this thing up. We'll call this slide 6, implementing Azure Firewall.
Okay, where do we begin?
Well, you got to start with the network, right? So you'll need a virtual network, and it's usually a good idea to divide it into subnets.
So like different sections for different types of resources.
Yeah, it's just good organization. And for production environments, we really recommend a hub and spoke model.
What's that?
So you have a central hub virtual network where your Azure Firewall lives.
Okay.
And then you have other spoke networks for your applications and services.
And they all connect back to the hub.
Exactly. So all traffic goes through the firewall in the hub. It's like a central security checkpoint.
So Azure Firewall is the king of the castle.
You could say that. All right, once you've got your network set up, you got to give Azure Firewall its own little corner of that hub network, a dedicated subnet.
Okay, so it needs its own space.
It does, and it has to be named Azure Firewall Subnet.
Specific.
Yeah, Azure's got its rules. And this subnet needs to be big enough to hold all the firewall stuff.
Okay, what about IP addresses?
Right, so the firewall gets both a public IP address for talking to the internet and a private IP address within that subnet.
And that private IP is important for making sure traffic actually goes through the firewall, right?
Exactly. You need to set up routing so that all your traffic that's going out to the internet or maybe even to other virtual networks gets sent to the firewall's private IP address.
So like setting up road signs that say all traffic this way to the firewall.
Yep. And you got to make sure those signs are pointing the right way for all the subnets where your workloads are running.
Otherwise, they'll bypass the firewall completely.
Exactly. All right, and then the final step is configuring the actual rules on the firewall itself. You've got NAT rules, network rules, and application rules.
That sounds like a lot to keep track of.
It's all about control, though. These rules determine how the firewall handles different types of traffic based on your security needs.
Okay, let's break those down a bit more. That's what slide 7, Azure Firewall Rules, is all about, right?
Yep. So first things first, the firewall checks the network rules. If a rule matches, it does its thing, and that's it for that connection.
If no match, then it moves on.
Right. On to the application rules. So network rules, they're your workhorse for controlling things like IP addresses, ports, and protocols.
So they're like the first line of defense.
Exactly. They handle all the non-web traffic, things that aren't using HTTP or HTTPS, and they can filter inbound traffic coming into your subnets too.
Okay, and what about those application rules?
Application rules, they're a bit more sophisticated. They look at things like domain names.
So they can say, for example, only allow connections to Microsoft.com.
Exactly. Or, you could allow traffic to your company's website, but block everything else. It's all about controlling which websites your resources can talk to.
And this is especially important for security, right?
Oh, absolutely. Because you don't want your systems connecting to shady websites or downloading malware or anything like that.
Makes sense. So network rules are more about the low-level network stuff, and application rules are more about controlling access to specific websites.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. Now, we talked about NAT rules earlier. Do you remember those?
Yeah, those were for exposing services to the internet, right?
Exactly. So let's say you want to be able to SSH into a virtual machine from outside your network.
Securely connect to it.
Right. You'd use a NAT rule to translate that incoming connection to the right internal IP address and port.
So like a forwarding address.
Yeah, you could say that. But here's the important part. You also need a network rule to actually allow that traffic in.
So the NAT rule says send it here, and the network rule says, okay, you're allowed in.
Exactly. They work together. You got to have both. So to recap, network rules are your bread and butter for controlling traffic between resources, especially across different subnets.
They're the foundation.
And application rules give you that fine-grained control over which websites your resources can access. It's all about keeping things secure and organized.
All right, we've covered a lot of ground here with security, but what about the whole domain name system? DNS, that's what slide 8 Azure DNS overview is all about, right?
Yep, DNS, it's the unsung hero of the internet.
It's what makes it possible to type in a website name instead of a bunch of numbers.
Exactly. And Azure DNS is Microsoft's cloud-based DNS service. It's super reliable and can handle a ton of traffic.
So it's what translates those nice, friendly domain names into the IP addresses that computers actually use.
That's it. And you can use it for all sorts of Azure services, app service, functions, blob storage, CDN, you name it.
So if I had a web app, instead of using that long, clunky Azure website address, I could use my own custom domain, like mycoolapp.com.
Exactly. And Azure DNS is what makes that possible.
So it's all about branding and making things easier for users.
Right. Now, to use Azure DNS for your own custom domains, you got to do something called domain delegation.
Sounds complicated.
It's not too bad. Basically, you just tell your domain registrar, the company where you bought your domain, to point your domain's name servers to Azure DNS.
So you're saying, hey, Azure DNS is in charge of my domain now.
Yep, that's it. And once you've done that, Azure DNS takes over.
It becomes the source of truth for your domain.
Exactly. Now, once you've delegated your domain, you can start creating DNS records.
What are those?
Those are the actual mappings between domain names and IP addresses. So, like, you'd create an A record to say www.mycoolapp.com points to this specific IP address.
Okay.
And there are other types of records too, like CNAME records, which are for aliases, and TXT records, which are for various things like verifying domain ownership.
So Azure DNS gives you all the tools you need to manage your domain and make sure everything resolves correctly.
Yep. It's a powerful service.
Oh.
All right, so we've talked about how to handle public-facing domain names. What about domain names within our own private network? That's where slide 9, Azure Private DNS, comes in, right?
Yeah, private DNS. Sounds intriguing.
So Azure Private DNS is like having your own internal phone book for your virtual networks.
So it's like a secret directory of resources that only people inside the network can see.
Exactly. It's a really secure way to handle name resolution within your VNets without exposing anything to the public internet. And it's super useful for things like private endpoints.
Those were those secure connections to Azure services, right?
Yep, the ones that bypass the public internet. So with private endpoints, you get a private IP address for the service you're connecting to. But you still need a way to translate the service's domain name to that private IP address.
And that's where private DNS comes in.
That's it. You create a private DNS zone and a record that maps the service's domain name to its private IP address.
So when a resource inside the VNet tries to connect to that service using its domain name, it gets directed to the right private IP address, all securely within the network.
Exactly. No need to go out to the public internet.
That's really neat. And Azure Private DNS also has this cool feature called auto-registration.
Oh, yeah. Auto-registration is awesome. It basically keeps your DNS records up to date automatically. So if you create a new VM, it automatically gets added to the private DNS zone.
So no more manually updating DNS records every time something changes.
Nope. Azure takes care of it. It's a real time saver.
And it reduces the chance of errors.
Definitely. So to sum it up, Azure Private DNS is your go-to for secure and reliable name resolution within your virtual networks, especially when you're using private endpoints or you have internal services that need to be reachable by name.
All right, we've covered a ton of information today. I feel like my brain is full.
Yeah, we've gone deep on NSGs, Azure Firewall, Azure DNS. It's a lot to take in, but it's all essential for building a secure and well-managed Azure environment.
I think our listeners are probably feeling the same way. So let's wrap things up and give them some key takeaways.
Absolutely. Today we navigated the landscape of Azure networking security and DNS. We started with those network security groups, those NSGs.
The gatekeepers, the bouncers, those distributed firewalls that control traffic at the subnet and individual network interface level.
Right. Then we moved on to Azure Firewall, that managed service that gives you centralized control and really beefs up your security.
It's like having a whole security team dedicated to protecting your Azure environment.
Exactly. And then, of course, we covered Azure DNS, both the public-facing service for managing custom domains and the private version for handling name resolution within your virtual networks.
And that private DNS is essential for those private endpoints and keeping your internal traffic secure.
It's all about layers of security and making sure everything works smoothly. You know, understanding these services is absolutely key to building a secure and well-managed Azure environment.
They're the foundation of everything.
Right. You can't really build a secure house without solid walls and a good security system.
That's a great analogy. And I think the key takeaway here is that these services, they all work together. They're not isolated components.
They're all part of a bigger picture.
And by understanding how they fit together, you can make sure your Azure environment is secure, efficient, and easy to manage.
Absolutely. Now, I'd like to leave our listeners with a thought. You've learned a lot about NSGs, Azure Firewall, and Azure DNS. But how are you going to use these tools to improve your own cloud infrastructure?
Yeah. What are your specific needs? What are your security goals? Think about how you can apply what you've learned today to build more robust and resilient Azure environment.
Take what we've talked about and run with it. Explore the different configurations, experiment a bit. It's your cloud after all. You're in control.
Excellent point. Well, on that note, thanks for joining us today for another deep dive. We'll see you next time.
See you then.